Welcome back everyone to Chapter 4, American Life in the 17th Century, video number 2, and we'll begin by discussing colonial slavery. As many as 10 million African slaves were transported to the New World within 300 years of Columbus's landing in 1492. Of those, about 400,000 were sold in North America, 95% to buyers in the South. Most slaves sold in North America arrived after 1700, and approximately 15% of slaves imported into the South came through the West Indies first. The Spanish and Portuguese monopolized much of the early slave trade, hauling their cargoes to the West Indies or South America. However, it was the Dutch who first introduced African slaves to North America. In 1619, a Dutch warship sold 20 slaves to buyers at Jamestown. By 1670, there were approximately 2,000 slaves in Virginia out of a total population of nearly 35,000. The high cost of African slaves convinced most planters to contract for less costly indentured servants. Three factors intervened to influence the cost of labor and the slave trade. Number 1, Bacon's Rebellion in 1676. Number 2, rising wages in England during the 1680s, which convinced more potential immigrants to stay in England. And number 3, the Royal African Company lost its slave trade monopoly in 1693. When the RAC lost its monopoly, Rhode Islanders and others entered the slave trade, a factor which increased the supply and pushed prices for slaves down. By 1650, African slaves comprised nearly half of Virginia's population. In South Carolina, slaves outnumbered whites 2 to 1. Most slaves in the southern colonies came from Africa's west coast: Angolans, Gambians, Barambaras, Mandingas, Igbos, Akans, Asantes, and other tribal cultures. During the Middle Passage, mortality rates varied, but averaged between 15% and 20%. Captured by African coastal tribes during raids or warfare against other African tribes, slaves were taken to markets on the beaches where European and American slave traders would purchase them. This is a map showing main sources and destinations of African slaves up to the beginning of the Civil War. The Middle Passage referred to the transatlantic sea voyage that brought slaves to the New World, the long and hazardous middle segment of a journey that began with a forced march to the African coast and ended with a trek into the American interior. And below you see a diagram of the inside of a slave ship. The slave ship Albatross is pictured here in this image painted in 1846. This was an eyewitness painting that captures the dankness, gloom, and despair that reigned in the slaver's cargo hold. Slaves who survived the Middle Passage to America were then sold at auctions in ports like Charleston, South Carolina, or Newport, Rhode Island. A few of the earliest African slaves in the Chesapeake and southern colonies gained their freedom, and some of them became planters and slave owners too. By the late 17th century, white planters reacted to rapidly increasing numbers of African slaves living in their midst by enacting slave codes and limiting the practice of freeing slaves. For example, in 1662, Virginia's legislature passed slave codes which decreed slaves and their children were chattel for the life of their white masters, property that could be willed to others. Some plantation colonies passed statutes making it a crime to teach a slave to read or write, laws intended to make communication and the other spread of ideas between slaves more difficult as well as to hinder escapes. Masters preferred African slaves to indentured servants because number 1, slaves lived for life, and number 2, colonial laws did not restrict the force masters could use in punishing infractions. Africans in America. Africans resisted life under slavery by number 1, working slowly, number 2, sabotaging tools and machinery, number 3, committing acts of petty theft against the master, number 4, running away, and number 5, committing violent acts of resistance or rebellion, which were rare and never successful. In 1712, a slave rebellion in New York City led to the killing of dozens of whites and the execution of 21 slaves. In 1739, in the Stono River Rebellion, South Carolina, approximately 20 slaves attacked a country store, seized a cache of guns, and made a run for Spanish Florida, killing 20 men in the process before being stopped by militia. In the Upper South, the Chesapeake tobacco colonies, slaves were very closely supervised by whites. Their work was also physically less demanding than that of slaves working on rice, indigo, or sugarcane plantations. In the Upper South, plantations were generally located close together, permitting slaves more frequent contact with their relatives and friends. Plantations in the Lower South grew rice, indigo, and sugarcane and were more isolated. Slaves there had less interaction with slaves on other plantations. Rapid growth of the slave population in the Chesapeake was due to, number one, the Atlantic slave trade, and number two, its own fertility or natural increase, making it one of the few slave societies in world history to perpetuate itself. As a consequence of natural increase, native-born African slaves managed to create a stable and unique slave culture, a combination of African and American elements of religion, language, and folk customs. On the sea islands off South Carolina's coast, several African languages, including Yoruba, Igbo, and Hausa, blended to produce Gola, a distinctively new language. African languages also influenced American speech, introducing new words like voodoo, gumbo, goober to our vocabulary. Other elements of African culture contributed to American life, including the West African ring shout dance, which led to the development of jazz and musical instruments such as the banjo and bongo drum. In our next video, we'll look at life in New England.